Maya Carter stepped out of the sleek black car that had ferried her from the airport to the heart of the city. Her heels clicked against the cobblestone driveway as she surveyed the towering glass facade of the apartment complex before her. It was a luxury high-rise, the kind reserved for executives, celebrities, and those who had worked tirelessly to reach the upper echelons of their careers. Maya belonged in that category. She had earned every bit of her success, and this apartment was a testament to her hard work. As an advisor to one of the most influential senators in the country, Maya's life was a whirlwind of meetings, policy proposals, and delicate negotiations. She had spent the last decade climbing the ranks, proving her worth in a world that often tried to undermine her. Now she stood on the threshold of a new chapter, a 6-month assignment in this bustling city to oversee a critical legislative initiative. The luxurious apartment was her oasis, a place to recharge after long days of intense work. I'm looking forward to settling in. As she rode the elevator to the 25th floor, she allowed herself a moment of pride. She had come a long way from her modest beginnings in a small southern town. Her parents had instilled in her the value of education and perseverance, and those lessons had carried her through countless challenges. Now, she was not just surviving, she was thriving. The elevator doors opened to reveal a hallway lined with modern art and soft lighting. Maya walked to her apartment, her heels muffled by the plush carpet. When she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she was greeted by a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering lights, and the open-concept living space was furnished with sleek, modern decor. She exhaled deeply, letting the tension of travel and work melt away. This was her sanctuary, a place where she could relax, think, and plan her next moves. But as she looked out over the city, a nagging thought crept into her mind. Would her presence here be questioned? Would her neighbors see her as an equal or as an outsider? She had faced such doubts before, and while she hoped for the best, she knew to prepare for the worst. Unpacking her suitcase, Maya shook off the unease. This was her time, her space, and no one could take that from her. Or so she thought. Maya's first morning in the new apartment started peacefully. Sunlight streamed through the massive windows, painting the walls with a golden glow. She brewed a rich cup of coffee and stood by the window, gazing over the sprawling city below. Today was her day to settle in, organize her belongings, and mentally prepare for the grueling weeks ahead. This city was to be her temporary home, and she wanted it to feel like one. By mid-morning, she had unpacked most of her boxes, arranging her books, awards, and framed photos on the shelves. Each item told a story of her life: the degrees from her Ivy League alma mater, the photograph of her shaking hands with the senator she now advised, and the small trinket her mother had given her as a reminder to stay grounded. As she worked, she became aware of the sounds beyond her door: footsteps, muffled voices, and the occasional click of a door closing. It was a lively building, full of people going about their lives. But something about the way the voices lowered when they passed her apartment felt off. By early afternoon, she decided to take a break and explore the amenities the building had to offer. She dressed in a casual yet elegant outfit, pressed slacks and a silk blouse before heading to the lounge on the ground floor. The space was as luxurious as the rest of the building, complete with plush seating, a grand piano, and a complimentary coffee bar. A few residents were scattered around, chatting or working on laptops. Maya approached the barista and ordered a latte. As she waited, she noticed a group of women sitting in a corner, their heads bent together as they spoke in hushed tones. One of them glanced her way, a flicker of something, curiosity, disdain, or both, crossing her face before she quickly looked away. Maya's chest tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. She was no stranger to being scrutinized, but it didn't make it any easier. She took her latte and found a seat by the window. As she sipped, she tried to focus on her upcoming work, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the women. Were they talking about her? Or was she imagining things? She hated how these moments made her second-guess herself. She had every right to be here, just as much as anyone else. Later that evening, Maya decided to take a walk through the building's private garden. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the garden was illuminated by soft ambient lighting. She strolled along the winding paths, taking in the fragrant blooms and the gentle sound of a nearby fountain. For a moment, she felt at peace, but as she rounded a corner, she nearly collided with a man coming the other way. He was tall, with graying hair and an expensive-looking suit. His startled expression quickly morphed into something colder when he saw her. "Excuse me," Maya said politely, stepping aside. The man didn't respond. Instead, he gave her a long, appraising look, his eyes narrowing slightly before he walked away without a word. Maya stood there for a moment, the encounter leaving a sour taste in her mouth. She shook her head and continued her walk, but the feeling of being unwelcome lingered. The next day, as she returned from a meeting, she found a note slipped under her door. It was typed with no name or signature, but the message was clear. "We value the safety and community of this building. Please be mindful of your behavior." Maya stared at the note, her pulse quickening. What behavior? She hadn't done anything out of the ordinary. Was this someone's idea of a warning? A way to intimidate her? She crumpled the note in her hand and tossed it into the trash. She refused to let this anonymous coward get under her skin. But as the days went on, the incidents piled up. A neighbor passing her in the hall would avoid making eye contact. Another would mutter something under their breath as she walked by. She overheard snippets of conversations. "Does she really live here? I've never seen her before." But when she turned around, the speakers would fall silent. It was subtle, but it was enough to make her feel like an intruder in her own home. Maya kept her head high and her shoulders squared, but inside, she was simmering with frustration. She had rented this apartment fair and square. She had nothing to prove to anyone, and yet, the weight of their judgment pressed down on her, threatening to crack her composure. The breaking point came one evening as she was unpacking the last of her boxes. There was a knock at her door, sharp and insistent. She opened it to find 2 police officers standing there, their faces unreadable. "Good evening, ma'am," one of them said. "We received a call from a resident about a suspicious person in the building. May we come in?" Maya's stomach dropped. Her worst fears had just walked through her front door. Maya stood frozen for a moment, gripping the edge of the door. The sight of the 2 officers, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter but equally imposing, felt like a punch to the gut. She had been here before, not in this exact situation, but in others that left her dignity bruised and her patience tested. Her mind raced, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "A suspicious person?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. "In their own apartment?" The taller officer cleared his throat, his expression neutral but his body language stiff. "We're just following up on a call, ma'am. A neighbor reported seeing someone they didn't recognize entering this unit. They were concerned about a potential break-in." Maya's grip on the door tightened. She could feel the familiar heat of anger rising in her chest, but she refused to let it show. Years of navigating spaces where she wasn't supposed to belong had taught her to stay composed, to wield her words like a weapon instead of letting her emotions take over. "Well, as you can see, I live here," she said curtly. "This is my apartment." The shorter officer shifted uncomfortably. "Do you mind if we come in? Just to confirm?" Maya's stomach churned at the implication. They didn't believe her. Or perhaps they did, but their training, or their biases, compelled them to ask for proof anyway. She had nothing to hide, but the intrusion grated on her. She glanced down the hallway and noticed a door slightly ajar. A shadow moved just out of sight. Someone was watching. With a sigh, she stepped aside and gestured for the officers to enter. "Make it quick," she said. "I have work to do." The officers stepped into the apartment, their eyes scanning the space. Maya stood with her arms crossed, her posture rigid. The apartment, with its sleek furniture and carefully curated decor, was a reflection of her taste and success. There was no sign of forced entry, no chaos, nothing to suggest that she didn't belong there. And yet, the officers moved through the space as if they expected to uncover some hidden proof that she was an imposter. "Do you have any identification?" the taller officer asked, breaking the silence. Maya's jaw tightened. She walked to her purse, which rested on the kitchen counter, and pulled out her driver's license. She handed it to him with a sharp glare. "And proof of residence?" he added. She opened a drawer and retrieved the lease agreement, slapping it onto the counter with more force than necessary. "There," she said. "Satisfied?" The officer glanced over the documents before nodding. "Thank you, ma'am. Everything seems to be in order." "Of course it is," Maya snapped. "Now, would you mind telling me which of my lovely neighbors decided that I looked too suspicious to live here?" The officers exchanged a glance, their professional masks slipping for a moment. They didn't answer, and Maya let out a bitter laugh. "Let me guess," she said. "They didn't leave their name. Just a concerned citizen, right?" "We can't disclose that information," the shorter officer said, his tone apologetic. but we appreciate your cooperation." Maya stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "I didn't cooperate. I complied. Let's not confuse the two." The officers had the decency to look uncomfortable. After a few awkward moments, they muttered their thanks and left the apartment. Maya closed the door behind them and leaned against it, her hands trembling. She wasn't sure if it was from anger, fear, or exhaustion. Maybe all three. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the moment of calm was shattered by the sound of her phone buzzing on the counter. She walked over and picked it up, her heart sinking when she saw the name on the screen. Senator Clark. Maya hesitated. She wasn't ready to explain what had just happened, but she knew she couldn't ignore the call. She took another deep breath and answered, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Good evening, Senator," she said. "Good evening, Maya," the senator replied, his voice warm but brisk. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're settling into the new city. Are you ready for the big meeting next week?" Maya glanced around her apartment, the space that had so quickly gone from a sanctuary to a battleground. She swallowed hard. "I'm settling in just fine," she said. "And yes, I'm ready for the meeting." "Excellent," the senator said. "I have no doubt you'll impress them. You always do." The words were meant as a compliment, but they felt hollow in the wake of what had just happened. Maya thanked him and ended the call, placing the phone back on the counter. She looked out the window at the city lights, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. They had no idea who she was. The neighbor who called the police, the officers who questioned her. They didn't know that she was one of the most trusted advisors to a U.S. senator. They didn't know that she had shaped policies that impacted millions of lives. To them, she was just a black woman in a place they didn't think she belonged. But they were wrong. She did belong here. She had earned her place, and she wasn't going to let their ignorance or prejudice push her out. Maya straightened her spine and walked to her desk where her laptop and a stack of files awaited her. She had work to do, and she wasn't about to let this incident derail her. But as she sat down and began typing, a new resolve took root in her mind. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been judged, questioned, or dismissed because of the color of their skin. She wasn't going to stay silent. The next morning, Maya woke with a fire in her chest. The previous night's events replayed in her mind like a bad movie, one she couldn't turn off. The knock at the door, the officers' skeptical looks, the way they had asked her, a grown woman who had worked every day of her life for everything she owned, to prove she belonged. It wasn't just insulting, it was exhausting. And what stung most of all was the knowledge that someone in this building, someone she was supposed to call a neighbor, had been the one to cast doubt on her presence here. She wasn't going to let it slide. This wasn't just about her dignity. It was about the principle. Maya had spent her life rising above the expectations society set for her. She had shattered every barrier in front of her, and she wasn't about to let a handful of entitled neighbors drag her backward. By mid-morning, she had made up her mind. She wasn't going to wait for anyone to apologize or explain themselves. She was going to confront the situation head-on. She had her suspicions about who had made the call. The door ajar, the shadow moving in the hallway. She replayed that moment in her mind and remembered seeing the man in the suit the night before. His cold, appraising look. She had seen his face before in the building's online directory. Richard Wainwright, a retired financial executive according to the bio he had written about himself. Maya almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A man who had likely spent his career in boardrooms and country clubs had decided that she, Maya Carter, didn't belong here. Dressed sharply in a tailored navy blazer and black slacks, Maya stepped out into the hallway. Her heels clicked with deliberate precision as she made her way to the door she suspected belonged to Richard. She raised her hand and knocked firmly, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. After a moment, the door opened, and there he was, Richard Wainwright. He looked almost surprised to see her standing there, his brow furrowing slightly as his gaze swept over her. "Good morning," Maya said, her tone polite but firm. "I'm Maya Carter. I live down the hall." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, I've seen you. Then you'll know this is my apartment," she continued, gesturing down the hall, the one the police were called to last night. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Maya said, her voice steady. "I know it was you who made the call, and I'd like to know why." Richard stiffened, his posture defensive. "I was looking out for the safety of the building," he said. "I didn't recognize you, and I thought it was better to be safe than sorry." Maya's jaw tightened, but she refused to let her anger show. Safe from what exactly? A woman unpacking boxes in her own home? "I didn't know it was your home," Richard replied, his tone growing defensive. "You have to understand. This is a high-end building. We don't usually see—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. But Maya knew exactly what he was about to say. "We don't usually see people like you." She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "Let me make something clear, Mr. Wainwright. I have every right to be here. I signed the lease. I pay my rent. And in case you're wondering, I can more than afford it." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Maya wasn't finished. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice like steel. "You assumed, based on nothing but the color of my skin, that I didn't belong here. But let me tell you who I am." She straightened her shoulders, her voice rising with quiet power. "I am Maya Carter. I'm an advisor to Senator Clark. I've spent the last decade crafting policies that shape this country. I've been in rooms you can't even imagine, making decisions that affect millions of lives. And yet, here I am, standing in a hallway, explaining myself to someone who didn't even have the decency to knock on my door and ask a simple question before calling the police." Richard's face had gone pale. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "I've worked too hard," Maya continued, her voice trembling slightly with emotion, "to let people like you question my worth or my right to exist in spaces like this. So, the next time you feel the urge to protect this building, maybe take a moment to consider whether your concern is actually rooted in your own prejudice." For a long moment, there was silence. Richard stood frozen, his face a mask of shame and discomfort. Maya didn't wait for him to respond. She turned on her heel and walked away, her head held high. As she reached her apartment, she heard his voice, low and hesitant. "Miss Carter, I'm sorry." She paused but didn't turn around. "You're not sorry for what you did," she said quietly. "You're sorry you got caught. Do better." With that, she closed her door behind her, shutting out the world. For the first time since moving in, she felt a sense of peace. She had stood up for herself, and while it didn't erase the pain of the incident, it reminded her of her own strength. But Maya wasn't done. This wasn't just about her. She sat down at her desk and began drafting an op-ed, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She wrote about the experience, about the countless others who had faced similar injustices, and about the need for systemic change. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without making an impact. By the time she finished, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the city lights sparkled outside her window. Maya leaned back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her. But it was a good kind of exhaustion, the kind that came from fighting for what was right. The apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of the city outside. Maya sat by the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of wine in her hand, staring out at the glittering skyline. The op-ed she had written earlier sat open on her laptop, the words staring back at her like a challenge. She had poured her heart into every line, recounting her experience with raw honesty, and calling out the systemic racism that had followed her throughout her life, even into the spaces she had worked so hard to reach. But now, in the quiet of the evening, the weight of the day settled on her shoulders. She thought about the officer's skeptical eyes, the cold note slipped under her door, and Richard Wainwright's pale face as she laid bare the truth of his actions. It wasn't just about him, though. It was about a society that had taught him, and so many others, to see her as a threat instead of an equal. Maya sighed and leaned her head back against the chair. She thought about her parents, who had worked tirelessly to give her the opportunities they never had. Her father, who had always told her, "You have to work twice as hard to get half as far." Her mother, who had taught her to hold her head high no matter what the world threw at her. They had prepared her for moments like this, but even they couldn't have imagined the weight of carrying those lessons into adulthood. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her out of her thoughts. She picked it up and saw a message from Senator Clark. "Read your op-ed draft. It's powerful. Let me know when you're ready to publish." A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. The senator had always supported her, not just as a professional, but as a person. He had encouraged her to use her voice, to speak out about the issues that mattered, and now Maya had the chance to do just that. But was she ready? The thought of putting herself out there, of exposing her pain and vulnerability to the world, was daunting. She had spent her entire career being measured, careful and strategic, knowing that even the slightest misstep could be used against her. This op-ed was raw and unapologetic, a stark departure from the polished image she usually presented. And yet, as she sat there, watching the lights of the city twinkle like stars, she realized she didn't have a choice. The world needed to hear her story, not just for her sake, but for the countless others who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. If her words could spark even the smallest change, it would be worth it. Maya closed her eyes, letting the memories of the past few days wash over her. The whispers in the lounge, the note under her door, the knock from the police. It had all been so familiar. She thought about all the times she had been questioned, doubted or dismissed because of the color of her skin. The professor who had once asked if she'd really written her own paper. The colleague who had assumed she was the assistant, not the advisor. The stranger who had clutched their purse tighter when she walked by. But she also thought about the victories, the scholarships she had earned, the policies she had helped craft, the lives she had touched through her work. She thought about the little black girls who might one day read her story and see themselves in her, who might realize that they too could occupy spaces that the world told them were off limits. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from her mother. "I'm proud of you, baby. Don't ever let them make you feel small." Maya smiled, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. She placed the phone down and turned back to her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She read the final line of her op-ed again. "To those who doubted me, questioned me, or tried to make me feel like I didn't belong, I am here. I have always been here, and I will not be silent." With a steady breath, she clicked the send button, submitting the piece to a major publication. It was done. Her story was out there now, and there was no turning back. As the night deepened, Maya felt a sense of calm take over her. The apartment no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like hers, a space she had claimed, not just with her money but with her presence, her voice, and her courage. She walked to the window and looked out at the city once again. Somewhere out there, people were talking about race, privilege, and belonging. Somewhere out there, someone was reading her words and seeing the world through her eyes. And somewhere, she hoped, change was beginning to take root. Maya raised her glass in a silent toast, to her parents, to herself, and to the future she was fighting for. She was no longer just surviving. She was leading. She was transforming. She was unstoppable. The city sparkled below her, a reminder of all the possibilities yet to come. And as Maya stood there, she knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning.